Silent strikes held across Myanmar on the second anniversary of a military coup that toppled Aung San Suu Kyi's government. For most of the day, roads and shops were largely deserted in Yangon and Mandalay. Activists had urged people to stay home to protest the army's power grab. Roads leading to Yangon's famous Shwedagon Pagoda were largely deserted. Buses in the city were empty, and there was a heavy security presence as well. A similar quiet was observed in Mandalay. Myanmar has been in turmoil since the military took over and began a bloody crackdown on dissent. Well, for more on the protests in Myanmar, journalist Kate Diamond joins us live now from Myanmar. Kate, we've seen these silent strikes before. They've been common in Myanmar over the past 2 years. What was the impact, though, of today's movement, and have we seen any response from the military?
So basically, this is a kind of sign that, the general public who are supporting the democracy is showing that they are still resisting the military regimes. Of course, we have seen the armed resistance. We have in the past, we had seen the mass protests, but due to the crackdown, people are not able to go on the street for the mass protest, or people are not able to join the armed resistance against the junta. But this is a time that they are able to show their resistance in the silent way. So far, we have not seen any response or any statement from the military regarding this. But before today, during the previous day, the authorities are alerting people or reminding people not to join the resistance, this silent strike. They are also forcing the shops and the business to keep opening, on this day. Also we have seen some, security forces, reminding people and forcing people to open their business, run the business today. So this is kind of like, response from the junta.
At the same time, Kate, there have also been reports that pro-military groups staged a rally in Yangon. What can you tell us about that protest?
So it is like even last year, they also had a same rally to support the military, support the junta. And it also had the same things today. So we had seen around 100 supporters march from the famous the land spot to the downtown Sule this afternoon. So the crowd was not that big, but the general public did not really join this pro-junta rally. So we have seen these like the familiar faces, all across the year supporting the junta. But when we were speaking to the general public were not really joining such rally. So the security presence was really tightened. So the authorities, the local authorities and junta forces were providing the security to that rally today in Yangon.
Kate, thank you for that update. Kate Diamond there reporting live from Myanmar.
Solidarity protests for Myanmar were held across the region. Demonstrators in Tokyo gathered outside the Myanmar embassy to demand that the army release Aung San Suu Kyi and all political prisoners.
ビルマの中にビルマの国民たちが5人たちの弾圧でどのくらい人たちが殺されている、どのくらい家が燃やされている、そういうことをビルマの中にいるの人たちと海外にいるの私たちは力を合わせて声が一緒だっていうのを見せないといけない。
Crowds also gathered outside the Myanmar embassy in Manila, chanting slogans. They demanded the army release thousands of political prisoners and trade unionists who have been in jail since the military unleashed a crackdown on dissent. They likewise called for a restoration of the democratically elected government in Myanmar.
We have to strongly support the Myanmar people's struggle, and that the various nations under the UN should lead the denunciation of the military junta there, and to call for the freedom of all the Myanmar people, and to free all political detainees, as well as to call for the immediate stop of the killings that is an ongoing spree now, headed by the military junta.
Hundreds protested outside the Myanmar embassy and the UN building in Bangkok. Many carried pictures of ousted jailed leader Aung San Suu Kyi and rose the three-finger salute, which became a symbol of anti-coup protests in Myanmar 2 years ago. A group even reenacted scenes of how protesters clashed with the army in the aftermath of the coup. As Mei Wong reports, Thai protesters want Myanmar to return to the path of democracy.
2 years is 2 years too long for Myanmar to be under a military regime, says these protesters gathered outside their Myanmar embassy here in Bangkok, Thailand. They want their voices opposing the military regime to be heard loud and clear, not just here in Thailand, but across to the rest of the world. They don't want the world to forget about their plight, and they want the world to continue to help them in order to bring the military down. Many of them have taken time off from work just to be here to allow their voices to be heard. In fact, they feel lucky that they're able to demonstrate on the streets, because back home in Myanmar, they can only conduct silent strikes, because if they were to go onto the streets, the military would either arrest them or shoot them. Now remember here that 15 million people in Myanmar are facing food shortages. At least 1 million people have already been displaced, and at least 3,000 people have been killed during this coup. So the protesters here say enough is enough. They want to return back to their normal lives. They want Myanmar to return onto the path of democracy. In fact, one card that they held up says, "Let dictatorship end in our generation."
ให้รู้ว่าเรายังต่อสู้อยู่นะเรายังฮึกเหิมอยู่คนที่อยู่ในประเทศไทยเนี่ยโอเคเราก็จะมาจัดม็อบหรือจัดกิจกรรมเพื่อให้ทั่วโลกรู้ก็คือกดดันทั่วโลกไปทาง NUG รัฐบาลเขาก็จะทำงานของเขาไปเพราะฉะนั้นแน่นอนฮะผมว่าไม่มีความลังเลที่จะไม่เชื่อว่าจะจบภายในปีนี้ครับ
Our people are suffering in Burma, dying every day without any reason. They are bombing our school, our church, our temples. There's no reason to kill our people. That's not a war zone.
The ASEAN foreign ministers are expected to meet in Jakarta at the end of this week. This will be the first time they're meeting since Indonesia took over as ASEAN chair. Some of these protesters are hoping that the ministers may be able to come up with some concrete measures as well as timeline in order to make the Myanmar military adapt them and to help restore democracy back into the country. Yet others told me they're not entirely hopeful because they feel that the grouping has failed them over the last 2 years during the coup, and that ASEAN has done nothing for the Myanmar citizens, and therefore they say they'll continue to come out to demonstrate to ensure that their voices are heard until the day that Myanmar goes back onto the path of democracy. Mei Wong, CNA, Bangkok.
Indonesia says it will send a top general to Myanmar. It's the ASEAN chair this year, and it's hoping to show Myanmar's leaders that a transition to democracy can be successful. President Joko Widodo told Reuters news agency that Indonesia has been through the same experience. He says that he hopes to share how his country had developed into a democracy from a similar beginning as a country with a military past. ASEAN has taken the diplomatic lead in trying to hold Myanmar's army accountable ever since the coup. Myanmar has been part of the bloc for more than 25 years. Coup leader Min Aung Hlaing agreed to ASEAN's so-called 5-point consensus some 2 months after the takeover. Among other things, the plan sought an end to the violence and dialogue among all parties. But it soon became clear that the army wasn't going to keep up its end of the bargain. ASEAN stepped up pressure by beginning to exclude the military rulers from its meetings. But instead of complying, the army began intensifying its crackdown on dissenters. Within ASEAN itself, there are differences over how to resolve the conflict. Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen, former ASEAN chairperson, visited Naypyidaw in January last year to revive peace efforts. But Malaysia criticised that visit, saying it should have been avoided. Current ASEAN chair Indonesia has also been calling for a new approach to deal with the crisis, while others, like Thailand and Cambodia, they're keen to maintain the bloc's long-standing non-interference policy. Even so, there's overall disappointment, especially after Myanmar executed 4 political prisoners last year. ASEAN's former envoy once said, "Even Superman cannot solve this conflict." Western powers, led by the US and the EU, have imposed multiple rounds of sanctions on military officials and those that do business with the regime. Washington passed the revised Burma Act in December. A key element in it was non-lethal support for those opposing the army's rule. Now, the act also opened the door to direct talks with the opposition, the National Unity Government, otherwise known as the NUG, something ASEAN is opposed to. Then, late last year, the UN Security Council adopted a landmark resolution on Myanmar for the first time in more than 7 decades. The resolution didn't involve sanctions, but it demanded an end to the violence and the release of all political prisoners, including Aung San Suu Kyi. Myanmar's powerful backers, China and Russia, along with India, abstained from voting.
Western powers have slapped the regime with fresh sanctions, incrementally tightening the economic noose around the military. The US and allies, including Canada, the UK and Australia, announced new measures targeting regime officials and, for the first time, Myanmar's energy sector. Among those hit, Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, the military's largest revenue-generating state-owned company. Now, Washington also imposed sanctions on officials involved in continuing airstrikes against civilians. Canada and the UK did likewise, punishing individuals and firms engaged in supplying aviation fuel to the Southeast Asian nation. Measures announced by Australia target members of the regime, as well as a military-run company. Meanwhile, the US, along with European Union nations and 20 other countries, have issued a joint statement calling for an end to the humanitarian crisis in Myanmar. They urge the international community to stop supplying weapons contributing to violence in the country. The joint statement also upholds ASEAN's central role in addressing the crisis.